Welcome back, everybody, and thank you for joining me today. This is your host, Cameron, with Neologic Studios, and today we're going to be going into Shawn Rose's When I Need You. Alright, so before we get started, if you're not familiar with this program yet, basically what I'm doing is inviting you into the mastering seat to see from my perspective just what goes on with the mastering engineer's job. During the month of September, I did a challenge with Christian Casito of Envious Audio, and we went head-to-head mixing songs from artists that submitted to us and got free mastering from us both. They got to hear both masters, and they didn't know who did what. They're just a blind listening test, and they get to pick which one they liked the most. So today we're going to be covering some mastering tips, and if you haven't followed the last two episodes, go check them out, because there are some really cool tips in there I think might help you. Okay, so today is going to be kind of a special episode because the last two masters that I did, I was starting to get in my head a little bit.
Oh my God!
Because by the time we had heard back from the artists, Christian had 2 wins under his belt and I'm at 0. So this track here, there's some things going on that you might see related to the previous episodes. I'm starting to do a little bit differently. I'm trying to adapt my game. Okay, so as usual, the very beginning is my ingesting and bringing the stuff to my template. I'll bring in the track, listen to it, set marker points along the timeline so I know roughly where the song is at structurally. I'm also getting a sense for loudness, and then I set about to look for references. Now here's a key thing. I'm very familiar with 7 Lions, and I felt like this track was trying to emulate, so right away I'm paying attention to things like loudness, as well as the overall tonal balance of the track. If you look at the spectrum on Voxengo's span there, you can see that both those tracks have a very particular character, and this is the stuff I'm trying to emulate that I think that the artist wants to emulate as well. Right away you can see I started diving into my chain and immediately start gain staging. Now this is a pretty quick process because I'm using a template. My very first chain, I didn't feel quite hit the mix, so I started bringing a second chain. So now I can quickly A/B between both chains, and then yet again I am bringing in another chain. So what's going on here? I'm getting in my own head, and by this point I felt like there was a lot of stuff happening in the mix that I was trying to fight to get the volume and the loudness and the transparency that he wanted. So you can see out of the 3 chains, I'm going back and forth, iterating between the 2, and I'm listening for sonic characteristics. The first chain is trying to do my typical loudness approach where I have the dual stage multi-band approach, but that I didn't feel like was allowing me to work. So while I'm on my break, I'm thinking about this process and what I can do to massage the mix, because nothing out of those 3 chains that I liked was working. So on my second chain, I'm doing a different multi-band approach, but I'm doing some expansion and compression, meaning I'm trying to emphasize the transients during that dynamics phase. So the very next phase that I go into is trying to figure out what's happening in the mix, and I'm spending more time getting intimate with understanding what the mix is doing as I'm driving my mastering chains, and try to reach a tonal balance that I think this track was trying to hit. Now, to hit this type of sonic character, those tracks didn't really have, the 7 Lines tracks didn't really have that much low end in them. It's more about saturation and distortion, and those are very key critical components to those masters that I feel like this particular artist master wants to try to emulate. As I'm continuing to iterate and refine through these mastering chains, as you're seeing here, I am going through and massaging things for stereo width, I'm massaging things for gain, I'm massaging things for loudness, and trying to find this optimal balance. And I do a little bit of automation with stereo width, but it really didn't call for that much. One thing that I want to point out here is as I'm A/Bing and even C'ing between those 3 mastering chains, I'm constantly trying to rebalance the tonal structure, meaning EQ pre and post of the dynamics chain. So the dynamics section is doing a bulk of the sculpting and lifting work at the same time. I feel like I've reached a spot where I have a decent master, and I'm gonna ABC between the 2, do some final checks and balances, and then before I get to that, I'm starting to notice, okay, again, I'm back in my head. So I go back and I print another version because I just wasn't satisfied with the result. And it could also be at this time, I wasn't really taking very long breaks or rests, so I'm constantly listening to it, and I could be fighting ear fatigue. And this is also a mental thing where by the time I get to the final result, my perception of things, this happens much faster than actual physical ear fatigue, is this psychoacoustic factor called normalization. Our perception of the things that are going on the track and EQ and tonal balance wise, we reach an equilibrium where our hearing wants to basically say, well, normalize to that. It's a psychoacoustic function too, not just a physical function. Physical function would be high-end loss over time due to high sound pressure levels. As you're exposed to that longer, that can definitely start to make everything sound softer and duller over time. But there's a psychoacoustic effect that happens much faster than the physical effect. And so that could be something to be aware of. And as mastering engineers, especially when we're trying to play with the levels that we're trying to hit, and if you're not working with a metering system like K metering, Bob Katz invented, it can be really hard to gauge overall loudness if you're dealing with those perceptual issues, which is why a lot of mixing engineers and mastering engineers will often reference low volumes, always being working at low volumes so that way you're not fatiguing your ears, but you also get a different perspective of the mix because of the way that sound pressure level changes the response in the human ear. Okay, so you're probably anxious to hear the song after I've been talking about my approach. So Christian's Master A is at the top, that's the one in blue, and then Master B is mine. It's the one that I ended up submitting was Chain C. And I'll go into that a little bit later, but first let's do some comparisons between what's actually happening between the two masters. Alright, so pretty cool. I actually had to lower my master by about 3.2 dB. I believe I wasn't peaking at more than -9. So, here's an interesting thing. I was actually about -10.5 integrated loudness. And so I believe the loudest part was about 7.9, which is fairly loud. So what does this perceived loudness have to do with the reason mine's getting turned down by 3 dB compared to Christian's Master, just so we're hitting roughly the same volume? And this has to do with gain structuring and the way that the dynamics processing is being done. Okay, so before I dive in, we noticed there was also some very different tonal balance things but going on between my master and Christian's Master. Christian's Master seemed to have a little bit duller top end. Mine definitely, you could say, even had a little too much, and that has to do with the reason I was trying to reference 7 lines. I'll show you what's happening, and I am referencing, I believe it is 7 lines in excision, and I think that was another me. With this track, especially during the chorus, the drop, if you will, you can definitely hear there are some issues. Well, it's not issues really. That's already... I believe the track was hitting -5.5 on the LUFS scale. So, without even hearing it, you can see that this track is just crushed. There is a crap load of distortion. Now, it's pleasant distortion that's happening. But also, look at this. They're really, compared to the top, there's more top end than low end. And this is sitting around 40 hertz. The lowest subtrack. So to get this loud, you really don't get to have that much bass.
Where's the bass?
Say it again.
Where's the bass?
You don't get to have that much bass when you want to hit this loud. We're intentionally using distortion and saturation, which is going to clip your sub, because a sub, the truest form of a sub, is a sine wave. As you approach a square wave, squarification, you start to lose the sound of the sub. The fundamental starts to drop because there's so many overtones in there that we just can't fit the fundamental in there. In order to keep that sine wave pure, you cannot squarify. Now you can get away with it to a degree, but this is what happens when you want to try to reach that loud. That sub still sounds loud. If you play this back on a PA system, if anybody's ever been to a 7-line show, you know he has some low end. It's there. And this is all about perceived loudness. And perceived loudness changes as sound pressure level changes. The louder the sound pressure level, our ears are going to react differently. So I had to keep that in mind as I was doing Shawn's master here with this track, because I believe he was trying to go for roughly the same sound. Now, I am nowhere near the same loudness level as his, or as 7 lines. But the issue comes into play, and this is the stuff that I was starting to get in my head about when I was going through those 3 chains. And this is trying to get that balance of perceived loudness and that sonic character that he was after. So let's go dive through my chains now, and I'll show you what I was going through. All right, so I'm just gonna play it, and you're not gonna hear it. But chain A, let's be the first to review. I'm just gonna go from the build-up. When you have this much low end, especially from the kick, he was using a kick that had a really huge sustain and a very prominent bump between 40 and 50 hertz. I would just be mindful, try to get your mix as balanced as you can for the intentional loudness you wanna hit. And the great way to do this is to set up a reference mastering chain in your mix and mix into that mastering chain with, you don't really have to do EQ. I would just try to get roughly an idea of what loudness level you're trying to hit, mix into that limiter, and see how that sounds. If that's presenting problems to you in your mix, tonal balance wise, or just the mix is starting to reveal that it's out of balance, then you have an idea of like, hey, I need to turn that up or turn that down, or EQ things in a certain way that correct for them. And so that's what I'm doing. The very first thing is I am reducing some low end going into my processors because there's just too much low end causing them to overwork. So let's look at the next step in the chain, and you'll see I'm doing even more correction to that low end. I am sculpting out the low end so much that this is something that master engineers are very critical about, because anytime you're introducing any type of EQ at the low frequencies like this, whether it's linear phase or standard type of EQ uses phase inversion. So basically what it's doing is it's canceling itself out by throwing something exactly out of alignment with it. What that can do is that can phase shift certain things and cause issues. Even with a linear phase processor, the linear phase will try to maintain that phase relationship so you don't have that issue. But the other issue that comes into play with those is that they introduce pre-ring, meaning you can have something shifted before it's actually supposed to happen. It's a battle of choosing which tool is best for the job. And a lot of mastering engineers will reach for linear phase because they like it in the upper frequencies. It doesn't really cause as big of a problem. But down here, this low, they just try to avoid EQing in general. They'll try to say, if there is an issue with your low end in your mix, try to fix it in your mix first, because typically it tends to be one element that's out of balance with the other elements, such as kick and sub. Now, anytime that you have kick and sub together and they're completely in phase, there's no issues with them, there's just too much, we might try to see if we can tame it here first. And then if we find that it's causing issues, we'll send it back to the artist to, hey, just turn those two down just a little bit. You as an artist can definitely benefit from this info, because when you're looking at this type of information, now you can make the call just by having that limiter set up or that mastering chain set up to mix into, to have a better idea and understanding of what's going to happen here downstream, or even if you're trying to learn how to mix or master on your own. Very next one in the chain, we have Neutron, and I was really just doing some EQ work with it. Here's where I'm doing the bulk of the dynamics processing. We have the Slate Digital virtual bus compressors, the VBC rack. You notice the needles, I am in the drop of the song, and it's just not doing a whole lot. I'm trying to do subtle, because if we look at his mix up here, you can tell that there's some peaks of, but they're so heavy. Everything is already so well mixed and so dense that there really isn't a whole lot of shaving that I have to do. the peak information, the kick, the transients, and the drums, those are the things that I'm looking for, that I have headroom to work with. Those are the things that mastering engineers will be massaging down and as we bring the overall track up to a certain level. And that just isn't the case with a lot of EDM music because of the way that it's mixed, which leaves us a lot less headroom to do shaving and sculpting this way. So I'm paying more attention to character and tonal response. I'm trying to shape the timing of those transients with this tool. As we continue on down the chain, some soft clipping through tape saturation. Again, you don't see the needles going anywhere close to the red, and that's even in there. Oh, okay, so maybe I am doing just a little bit, but still, it's not actually going into the red. I'm not trying to hit it super hard because even without the needles moving, it's adding character. It's doing some work on the signal. And so I'm trying to find a good balance between the two. And you notice my output is not linked to my input. So I'm actually helping to control that output. And that's because going into the next section here, here's where I'm doing even more distortion. So moving on, just a super simple limiter to help massage start massage the ceiling. I'm just trying to shave those peaks that were just causing problems before I hit one more distortion box. And then finally, here we are, Slate Digital FGX. And this is where I'm trying to do the bulk of my lifting, or the final ceiling work, if you will. Now, why the separation and chain between that? Again, I was in my head, I was trying to figure out what that thing needed, and I was experimenting. This was an experimental chain. I am playing around, trying to hear something that I just wasn't happy with. So again, that's why I moved on to chain number 2. Much simpler. The thing that I love about the MIC DSP ML4000 is that you have a really cool way of doing kind of like dual stage or parallel expansion and compression right in this same tool. So the way that it's working on the track, I'm actually using the expander to try to emphasize peaks, all of those transients in there. And so it's shoving the signal in a little bit sharper, like a little bit harsher into the compressor. Okay, so just between those two chains alone, A and B, you can notice B sounds quite a bit more prominent in the low end. It's pushing the kick and the snare a little bit differently. You notice when I turned off the ML4000, it just turned into a distorted mess. And that's because this is actually doing more ducking work and compression with gain reduction, but I'm not trying to lift the signal back up to make up for that gain loss. That way I can hit everything else downstream a little bit easier. So Saphira and Isotope, I believe the maximizer here, is doing the last bit of control. So post dynamics, I'm doing a little bit of more contouring, a little bit dynamic EQ because I found some trouble spots just with the mix itself as it was being presented through this mastering chain before I hit my limiter. You can tell it's quite a bit of makeup there, right? Negative 8.3 to -1 ceiling. We have true peak on. And this is another thing that comes up often is people don't understand what true peak is versus just digital peak limiting. And true peak is being it's talking about reconstructing the signal in the analog domain. So as your digital to analog converter will read that clipped information digital, sometimes the vector, meaning like how sharp this point actually is, can cause the analog circuit to or the digital filter to reconstruct it above what that thing is capable of doing. And then you end up with clipping distortion or converter distortion, and that just doesn't sound right either. It can be a distortion that we don't have control over, and that's why we want to control true peaks. Back to my chains because I wasn't happy with B either. So let's move on to chain number 3. This is the third chain that I built. Again, I was so in my head over the last 2 losses that I started to question what my process was. And so if I'm looking at this chain, we're getting back to my typical one. Now this is my signature chain, if you will. I've modified it a bit because I always have to modify it for every song. The needs of every song are different. So let me just show you what's happening with this one. Okay, so yeah, you can hear right at the end there, as soon as I turned off that ozone EQ, there went our low end. In fact, it was so bad that you can hear the distortion in the kick because there's just so much low end in the kick that was just causing an issue. So that's why we have to pay attention to how much of frequency response we put down in certain elements. So without that there, I would not have been able to hit my loudness target without distorting that kick that way. And I know the artist would not have intended for that kick to sound that way. So moving on, that was the very first thing I had to do in the chain, was to start to correct those issues. Now, I put that right after my REQ because my REQ is usually doing that 7.1K dip right about there. And that's a very subtle button, but it usually sets me up downstream to handle things in the high end a lot easier, because with this stuff, as with a lot of EDM, when we're dealing with loops or a lot of synths, there tends to be a lot of harmonic content up there, and it's so dense already that it could overwork my chains. I just like to nip it in the bud very early, do a little bit of bump to make it a little easier downstream. So as we go into the C1 compressor, you can tell I'm already doing quite a bit of gain reduction, but let me just play this back muted so you guys can hear what's actually, or see what's happening. I am treating just the very peaks of the signal. Anything above -8 is being treated softly into this curve. And this curve, at -25:1 ratio for gain reduction, let's just say that's a lot, right? Let's go in. Let me A/B with this on and off, and I'll show you guys what's happening. So paying attention to the order of things you do can help preserve the integrity of the mix. So without that compressor on there, you can tell I'm just overworking everything downstream. And that's because, for two reasons. One, everything downstream is gain staged for the output of this compressor, meaning I am not doing any gain makeup with this compressor. It's just doing the reduction, which makes it a lot easier to start taming things downstream. Now you notice my very next thing in the chain is going to be this L3. And if you see, I'm not really using the L3. It's only going to be shaving certain peaks, and I felt were just too loud. And that's even after that 25:1 gain reduction. So you might not see it work at all. There was maybe only 1 or 2 spots I found throughout the entire track, and that's what this is set up for, just to catch those spikes that could cause too much work on those compressors. As we move on, you'll see my next one is the linear multiband. Again, we're just doing a bulk of the tonal sculpting here. This is a gentler compressor, not really being used for limiting. And then more automation with Waves Center. This is a great tool for stereo width and balance. All right, so I'm going to show you guys a really cool trick, and that is to watch for the sides. So the center channel is in green, and the sides information is in red. Now, I want you to pay attention to the peaks as they go up and down. Anytime the sides go above the green, then you know you have some phasing issues that might result in playback systems. Meaning that those phase issues are going to start to cause themselves to cancel out. In upper frequencies, it's not as big of a deal, especially if you're listening in headphones or in a stereo speaker system for home environments. But in a PA system for live audiences, this is where it becomes critical. And I am playing with this in a way that treads the line. I am towing the line just between reaching for that spot where we get that pleasantness, the enveloping sense of the song wrapping around us with the stereo width as the way the mix was presented, so that there is more emphasis on those points of the song. They wrap around us during certain points, and then the things that are in the center need to drive when they need to drive, but also for mono compatibility. I am balancing between those two choices because you can still have a great presentation in stereo that is mono compatible, but anytime you see those peaks for the sides reach way above your mono compatible stuff, that's where you're going to lose a lot of information. So moving on, back to my chain, because yet again, I was running into issues where I was in my head. That's the running theme of today. We've already gotten familiar with this chain, right? I've shared this chain in my previous vlog. If you guys haven't followed yet, I've covered Cakewalk and Ableton and showing you guys reconstructing this chain with just stock plugins, and the results that you can get with just stock plugins is pretty astounding. You don't have to go buy thousands and thousands of dollars worth of plugins if you have what's already in your DAW. And I proved that they're capable of it because both examples that I did were for clients that ended up releasing those masters. So it's definitely possible to get great sounding masters with just the stock plugins. Don't let people fool you that you have to spend tons of money, right? Right. I think the biggest lesson for me was that I need to get out of my own head and start being more objective. I was looking for that win. The ego started to get in the way because I wanted to enhance the master. And sometimes the best thing we can do is just do no harm. And in those cases where Christian won the previous two, he wasn't harming the master. Now there's an interesting question that I want to pose for you guys is, anytime that you can't tell the difference between what's happening, or if you're not sure of what the mastering process is, are you going to default to what sounds most like your mix because it sounds familiar? And if that's not your intent, like, hey, I want to leave this off to the master engineer, do his mojo, make it sound better than I can make it, that intent going into it can shape your perception of what you get back, then you have to keep that in mind. That should be your intent going to a master engineer. With this battle, I feel like I came ahead, but only after much chagrin, to refining my mastering process and being willing to experiment. Now, here's the thing. If you're an artist, you should know that there's plenty of trial and error that goes on, right? It's not any different with mastering. I'll leave you with that, folks. So if you have any questions, submit them to the Gauntlet at neologicstudios.com, and I will answer them in future episodes. Otherwise, feel free to leave comments in the video below. Check out Shawn Rose. Kudos to this man for submitting the mix because he's got some great stuff. I believe he got picked up. He just released this song, so it's out worldwide now. Go take a listen. And here's my big ask of you guys. If you want to see more content like this, I'm only giving myself 2 months to get this off the ground because I don't know if this is going to take off or not. Let me know if this is working for you guys because I want to be able to help you guys get better results with your mixes and masters. So go to my Patreon page, link below, and consider donating or subscribing. Now for artists, I have a special tier set up for you guys. It's $50 a month. If you guys want a free master or coaching, I can do one of the other once a month. This is included in that tier. So for $50, you get all of the perks. You get to answer first. I'm gonna have special content coming up just for you guys. You guys get access to the polls first. Everything that I am doing is setting up to be community oriented. So let me know what you guys want, and especially in the future, what perks would you guys like to see for this community, so that way I can take care of you guys first. And lastly, I just want to thank you guys for watching. Well, there you have it there, folks. Thank you so much for joining me again today. And if you have anything at all, feel free to leave it in the comments below. I'd love to know what you guys think of these episodes, and until next time, happy mixing.